The library catalog showed my papers accessioned under a donor name that wasn't mine, and the reading room desk told me I'd need an appointment to see them. I met him because he carried a box I couldn't lift. I'd been unloading my car behind the building after hours, arms full, when the bottom gave out. He caught the spill before it hit the pavement, steadied the box against his hip, and asked where it was going. I told him the archives. He said he worked upstairs and walked it in with me, badge already swinging from his neck. He didn't open anything. He just knew how to move through the doors. I'd been preparing a small donation, correspondence, notebooks, drafts I didn't want in my apartment anymore. Not for money, for order. He pointed out acid-free folders I hadn't used. Offered to rehouse things properly so nothing warped. He said it would keep the ink from fading. He said it like maintenance, not importance. He started stopping by my place to help me sort. Not everything, just what I'd already decided to let go of. He brought gloves. Labeled boxes in a hand that was careful and legible. When I hesitated, he waited. When I agreed, he moved quickly so I didn't have to sit with it. The closeness came from quiet competence. From him knowing how to touch paper without leaving a trace. He taught me how to flatten a letter without creasing it. How to separate envelopes from contents. How to note provenance so future readers wouldn't get lost. He asked who the letters were to, not what they said. When I told him, he nodded and wrote it down. The first night he stayed was because we worked late and the buses stopped. He slept on the couch with a book open on his chest, lights still on. In the morning, he made coffee and stacked the boxes by date. After that, he was there when I needed him. Not always. Reliably. He knew which things I'd never reread and which ones I kept touching as if they might warm. He never asked why. When the archives requested a deed of gift, he brought the form already filled. Names, dates, scope. He highlighted the signature line and said it just clarified custody. He said it didn't change ownership. He said it protected my intent. I signed at the kitchen table while he held the pages flat. He handled delivery. He handled intake. He sent me photos of the boxes on steel shelves, barcodes clean and straight. He said everything was safe now. He said it would be easier to breathe. I didn't go back for a while. There was nothing left to do. The email from the library arrived on a morning I wasn't thinking about any of it. Catalog updated. Collection available. Reading room hours attached. I clicked through out of habit and saw the donor field. His name sat where mine had been in my head. At the desk, the clerk was polite. She said access was open by appointment. She said the donor had requested coordination through him for handling instructions. She asked if I wanted her to notify him that I'd stopped by. I said no and stepped away. The quiet of the stacks pressing in. Trying to place the moment when care for my words had turned into control over where they lived. After that visit, he didn't pretend nothing had happened. He came by that evening with dinner and a printout of the catalog record. Set it on the counter like it was something to review, not correct. He said the archives had standardized fields. He said donor names sometimes reflected facilitation. He said it didn't change what the papers were. I asked why his name was there. He said it was administrative. He said the deed listed him as the intermediary because he'd handled intake. He said it was cleaner for the library to have one point of contact. He said my intent was still noted in the scope statement. He showed me the sentence. It was accurate. It didn't say what I thought it said. The sorting continued. Not at my place this time. At his office after hours under the same lights he used for everything. He spread items out and asked what I wanted next. Another box. Another tranche. He said momentum mattered. He said it was easier to finish. I let him take more. The intimacy deepened in the margins. Late nights. Shared silence. His hand resting on the table near mine while we waited for a scanner to finish. He learned the way I hesitated over certain notebooks and would slide them back into the later pile without comment. When the library asked for clarifications, they emailed him. He forwarded summaries to me. When they asked for permissions, he drafted responses and waited for my nod. When I nodded, he sent them. The first time I noticed I hadn't seen an original in weeks, it didn't register as loss. It felt like completion. He suggested a small event, a talk, readings from the collection. He said it would anchor the donation in public memory. He said it would be good for me. He said the library preferred to coordinate through one liaison. He put his name down. I stood beside him at the lectern while he introduced the work. He thanked me for trusting the process. He spoke about stewardship and care. People nodded, applauded. I smiled and read what I'd been asked to read. After, a librarian asked him about future access. He said they could schedule requests through him. He said that would prevent mishandling. He said he'd protect the materials. He didn't look at me when he said it. A week later, I tried to request a box. Not to take home, just to sit with. The reading room replied with a polite form. Appointment required. Coordination through the donor. I forwarded it to him. He replied that he was traveling. He said he'd handle it when he got back. He said there was no urgency. There were small shifts. My keys no longer opened certain doors after hours. My badge didn't scan. He said security updates happened all the time. He said he'd add me back. He didn't say when. The work between us stayed close. He still listened. Still asked what mattered. Still held space for my choices. He just moved faster after I chose. When the next deed arrived, he had already signed his portion. He slid it across the table and pointed to my line. He said this one clarified long-term care. He said it ensured consistency. I signed because the language mirrored what I'd already agreed to, and because he was right about consistency. The catalog updated again. My name moved. Not removed. Nested. I noticed it late, alone, clicking through records I was no longer invited to handle, understanding that the distance wasn't physical. It was procedural. It had weight. And it was already in place. The midpoint arrived as a correction. The library sent a notice about access protocols, copied to both of us. It explained that high-demand collections required a managing steward to coordinate requests, handle condition reports, and approve handling. The steward listed was him. The owner field was blank. I forwarded the email and asked if that was standard. He replied that it was a safeguard. He said materials like mine attracted attention once they were cataloged. He said attention created risk. He said the library preferred someone trained to say no. He said that was his job. He invited me to the stacks after hours to show me how things were stored now. White gloves. Temperature-controlled room. My boxes lined up with call numbers that no longer referenced me directly. He opened one carefully and showed me how clean everything looked. He said this was what preservation felt like. I nodded. That night, he brought over a folder of correspondence. Requests from researchers, journalists, a graduate student asking for permission to quote. He summarized each one and said which he'd approved and which he'd deferred. He said he'd kept my voice in mind. I asked why he hadn't asked me. He said he'd learned my preferences. He said he was saving me from repetition. He said if something felt off, I could always override. I didn't test that. The midpoint hardened a week later, quietly, when a scholar emailed me directly to thank me for granting access. She referenced his name as the approving authority and copied him on the note. I hadn't granted anything. I replied politely and asked what she meant. She forwarded the permission email. It was signed by him on my behalf. I called him instead of writing back. He said that request had been time-sensitive. He said he knew I would have said yes. He said the work was important. He said I trusted him. I did. After that, approvals went out faster. He stopped forwarding requests unless they were unusual. He said I'd asked him to handle it. He said this was what handling looked like. The next time I visited the reading room, the clerk asked me to wait. She made a call, came back and said my appointment wasn't on the schedule. She said the steward would need to authorize it. I stood there long enough to notice how still the room was without me inside it. I texted him. He replied that he was in a meeting. He said we'd sort it out later. He said there was no rush. When I got home, There was a message from the library system confirming updated stewardship terms. Effective immediately. Long-term oversight assigned. His name again. I searched my email for the consent. Found it buried in a thread I'd skimmed weeks earlier. The language was precise. Delegated authority. Scope broad. Duration undefined. My signature was there. The midpoint settled then, not as betrayal but as completion. He had become the voice that answered for my words. And the library had stopped asking me anything at all. After that, the requests stopped finding me. Emails arrived already answered. Decisions already made. When I asked what had come in that week, he summarized. One sentence per request. Approved. Deferred. Declined. He spoke in outcomes, not choices. I stopped recognizing my own handwriting in the margins of things. Everything was typed now. Clean. Neutral. Nothing that could be misread. He began to schedule without asking. Reading room visits for others. Talks. Loans to exhibitions. He said it was important to keep the collection visible. He said visibility justified the care it required. He said this was how archives stayed alive. I believed him because the rooms were full. At an event I hadn't planned, a donor thanked him for trusting me with the material. I smiled and corrected nothing. Another scholar asked him whether future editions were expected. He said we were discussing scope. He said it was evolving. At home, he asked what else I wanted to release. He said the archive worked best when it was complete. He said partial donations confused provenance. He said people would read gaps as intent. I brought another box. The intimacy lived in the handling, in the way he lifted a page by its edge, in how he asked permission with his eyes before turning anything fragile. He didn't rush me. He waited until I nodded. That was how it continued. The first time I said no, it sounded small. I told him I wasn't ready to add a notebook. He said, of course. He said there was no pressure. He slid it back into the drawer and locked it. I didn't notice him keep the key. Weeks later, I asked to see that notebook. He said it was better preserved off-site. He said we'd moved sensitive items to secure storage. He said access was limited to prevent deterioration. I asked how to request it. He said he'd handle it. Later never arrived. When I tried to enter the stacks on my own, security stopped me. Badge access revoked. Temporary measure, they said. Steward request. They apologized and offered to call him. I declined and walked out, the echo of my steps following me into the hall. That evening, he explained it calmly. He said boundaries protected trust. He said too many hands risked damage. He said this wasn't about me. He said it was about the work. He said I should be relieved. I nodded because I still wanted to believe that. The catalog updated again. A new note under stewardship. Collection integrity maintained through centralized oversight. My name appeared only in the abstract. When I asked why I was no longer listed as a contact, he said it reduced confusion. He said people didn't know who to ask otherwise. He said clarity mattered. I realized then that I hadn't been asked anything in a long time. Not because there were no questions, but because there was already an answer. I learned about the exhibition from a flyer I hadn't been sent. It was taped to the library entrance, clean design, careful typography, selections from the collection, curated by him, opening reception listed. My name appeared in the description, not in the credits. Language softened, framed, contextualized. I went inside and asked at the desk how the selections were chosen. The clerk smiled and said the steward had finalized them. She said he'd done a thoughtful job narrowing the scope. She said it was important to present a cohesive narrative. I walked through the gallery alone. Pages I recognized mounted behind glass. Lines I'd written in rooms that no longer existed, now labeled with dates and themes I hadn't assigned. His captions sat beneath them, explaining intent with a steadiness I didn't interrupt. Visitors moved slowly. They nodded. They read. They whispered to each other about how intimate it felt. No one asked where I was. At home that night, I told him I'd seen the exhibition. He said he was glad. He said it was important that I felt included. He said people were responding well. He said the library was pleased with the turnout. I asked why I hadn't been consulted. He said consultation slowed curation. He said curators needed distance. He said I was too close to the material to see its shape now. He said this was why he was there. The requests increased after that. Media inquiries. Loan proposals. A publisher asking about excerpts. He filtered them without forwarding. When I asked what had come in, he summarized. Approved. Declined. Under review. I asked to read one request myself. He said which one. I said any. He said they were all similar. He said nothing stood out. The following week, a journalist emailed me directly. She said she'd been told I preferred to route questions through my steward. She said she hoped that was still correct. I stared at the message until the cursor stopped blinking. I replied that I would answer directly. She wrote back apologizing and said the interview had already been scheduled with him. She said she was looking forward to discussing my work through his perspective. That evening, I told him I wanted my access back. Not everything, just enough to answer for myself. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said I was reacting to visibility. He said attention could feel like loss when it was really expansion. He said this phase was delicate. He said stepping in now could fracture trust with the institution. I asked whose trust. He said theirs. He added that everything I wanted to say was already being said. He said he was careful with my voice. He said the archive was bigger than either of us now. I didn't argue. I went to the bedroom and looked for the locked drawer where the notebook used to be. It wasn't there. The drawer opened to empty space, smooth and finished. When I asked him where it was, he said it had been rehoused for safety. He said it belonged with the rest of the collection. He said private materials deteriorated faster outside controlled environments. I asked if I could see it. He said not right now. I realized then that the things I hadn't donated had followed the others. Quietly, because they fit the narrative better together. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe, understanding that the intimacy hadn't disappeared. It had been archived, and I no longer knew how to request access to myself. The letter arrived on institutional letterhead, forwarded to me by mistake. It thanked the steward for the successful transfer of remaining personal materials and confirmed that the collection was now complete. Intake closed. Access protocols finalized. Future inquiries to be directed accordingly. There was an attachment. Inventory summary. Box counts. Item descriptions. At the bottom, a line noting that all materials had been received in good condition, including previously unaccessioned private notebooks. I read that line twice. When I asked him about the letter, he said the library had followed best practice. He said completeness protected meaning. He said fragmentation invited misinterpretation. He said it was better this way. I asked when I'd signed for the last transfer. He said I hadn't needed to. He said the earlier deeds covered it. He said that was the point of stewardship. I went to the library the next day and asked for an appointment. The clerk typed my name and frowned gently. She said access was restricted. She said the steward would need to authorize any handling. She asked if I wanted her to notify him that I'd come by. I said no. I stood in the lobby long enough to hear footsteps behind the desk and the quiet hum of the climate system keeping everything at the same temperature. That afternoon, he came home with flowers and a bottle of wine. He said the exhibition had been extended. He said donors were pleased. He said the work was being taken seriously. I asked where my notebook was. He said it was safe. I asked if it was mine. He said ownership was complicated once things entered care. He said what mattered was preservation. He said I didn't really want those pages back out in the world, did I? I didn't answer. The final change came quietly. The catalog updated overnight. A note appended to the collection record. Donor deceased. It wasn't literal. It didn't mean death. It meant the end of editions, the end of revisions, the end of a living voice. When I showed it to him, he said that was archival language. He said it just meant the body of work was closed. He said it gave scholars confidence. I asked where that left me. He said with freedom. The next morning, I received an invitation to the exhibition opening. General admission. No special access. My name printed in the program as the subject, not the speaker. I didn't go. I packed my apartment slowly, not to move, just to see what was left. Books without notes, papers without margins. The desk drawer where I'd once kept things I wasn't ready to give up. It was empty. That evening, he told me he'd accepted a new role. More responsibility, more oversight. He said the collection would be in good hands. He said I should be proud. I nodded because there was nothing left to correct. The words I had written were now stable, protected, interpreted. The rooms they came from no longer mattered. Neither did the person who had written them, except as context. What I had lost wasn't the papers. It was the ability to touch my own past without permission. And the last thing he said before turning out the light was that history needed caretakers more than authors. By then, my work was already speaking without me.